It was 3 in the morning when the knocking began. Isaac lay on his back, staring up at the darkened ceiling, his eyes struggling to adjust to the shadows creeping across the room. He hadn't slept well in weeks, not since he'd moved into this creaky, drafty old house, nestled on the outskirts of town. The floorboards groaned with age, and the walls carried the weight of stories untold. The realtor had assured him the house was sturdy despite its wear and tear. But every night, Isaac felt like it was slowly crumbling around him. Tonight, however, it wasn't the creaks or the cold that kept him awake. It was the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Soft at first, almost gentle, like a polite visitor waiting for him to answer the door. But when the knocking continued, something about it set Isaac's nerves alight. It wasn't the kind of sound one could easily ignore. He sat up, pulling the covers closer, as if they could shield him from the dread crawling up his spine. Just the house settling, he told himself. But deep down, he didn't believe it. This was too precise, too deliberate. Another knock echoed through the silence, louder this time, closer. Isaac froze, his mouth dry, heart hammering against his ribs. Maybe a branch tapping against the window. His eyes flicked to the glass. Nothing. The trees outside were still, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. The knock came again, a hollow sound that seemed to resonate from deep within the walls, as though it was traveling from one room to the next, slowly making its way toward him. But that's impossible. The house was old, yes, but he had never heard anything like this. It wasn't the familiar moaning of aged timber or the whistling of wind through the cracks. No. This sound was too rhythmic, too calculated. There was intent behind it. The knocking continued, steady and relentless. Each thud grew louder, more insistent. Isaac squeezed his eyes shut, willing it to stop, but it didn't. The sound burrowed into his mind, dragging with it the distinct feeling that whatever was making it wasn't human. For a brief moment, he considered getting out of bed and investigating, just to put his mind at ease. But the thought of stepping into the hallway filled him with paralyzing fear. No, he thought, gripping the covers tighter. Stay in bed. It's safer here. The knocking grew closer still, now coming from the other side of his bedroom wall. Isaac's breath hitched. Who, no, what, was out there? He strained to listen, but there was no shuffling of feet, no sound of footsteps. Just that infernal knocking. It wants in. The thought slithered into his mind unbidden, cold and undeniable. His heart pounded louder, in sync with each knock, as though it were echoing the sound. Isaac felt a sweat break out on his brow. His stomach churned, and his mind began to spiral. What if it was already inside? What if it was just waiting for him to open the door, to let it in? Or worse, what if it didn't need an invitation? The knocking stopped. Isaac let out a shaky breath. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, more unnerving than the sound had been. He listened, his ears straining to catch any sign of movement. But all he could hear was the frantic thrum of his own heartbeat. Minutes ticked by in agonizing quiet. Isaac's limbs felt like lead, too heavy to move. He stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But it didn't. Nothing happened. The house was deathly still. Slowly, cautiously, Isaac allowed himself to relax, muscles unclenching one by one. He convinced himself it was over. Maybe it had just been his imagination, a trick of his sleep-deprived mind. He exhaled, trying to release the fear from his body. Knock. Isaac flinched violently, his heart leaping into his throat. The knock wasn't at the wall this time. It was at his bedroom door. The door rattled slightly in its frame, as if whatever was on the other side was gently testing it. It knows I'm in here. Isaac's mind raced. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever this was, it had purpose, and it wanted him. The knocking resumed, steady and persistent, louder than ever now. The door shuddered with each impact, the hinges groaning in protest. Isaac bit his lip, suppressing a whimper. His body screamed at him to run, but where could he go? There was nowhere to hide, no escape. He was trapped. The knocking continued, relentless. Isaac felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, panic swelling in his chest. He knew, deep down, that this thing, whatever it was, wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. And he didn't want to know what that was. "Don't open the door," he told himself, over and over, as if the mantra could somehow save him. "Don't open the door." The knocking stopped again, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Isaac held his breath, listening intently. Then, with a creak, the door handle slowly began to turn. Isaac's blood ran cold. He threw himself out of bed, heart racing as he backed into the farthest corner of the room. His eyes were glued to the door as the knob twisted and rattled, inching closer to release. "Please, please, please," he silently begged. "Don't open." For a moment, it seemed like his prayer had been answered. The knob stilled and the door remained closed. Then, with a sudden violent force, the door burst open. But nothing entered. Isaac stared into the dark hallway, his breath shallow and quick. The open doorway yawned at him, a black void that seemed to stretch endlessly. He waited for something, anything, to step through. But there was nothing, only the darkness, silent and impenetrable. Isaac didn't move. He couldn't move. His body was locked in place, eyes wide, every muscle taut with terror. His mind screamed at him to shut the door, to close himself off from whatever lurked beyond it. But then he heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, like a whisper in the wind. But as Isaac strained to listen, the sound grew clearer. Breathing. Deep, raspy breaths, coming from just outside the doorframe, the sound of lungs that hadn't tasted air in centuries. The breathing drew closer, a wet, labored inhale followed by a rattling exhale. Isaac's legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the floor. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The breathing was right there, just out of sight, standing on the threshold of his room. And then, slowly, ever so slowly, something stepped into the room. He couldn't see it, but he felt it. The temperature dropped, and the air grew thick, suffocating. Isaac's skin prickled with goosebumps as the presence loomed over him, its invisible eyes burning into his soul. The knocking had stopped, but now, there was something worse. It was inside, and it wouldn't be leaving.